Welcome back to the Vegalogue podcast Advocacy edition. I'm Alex Lashchuk.
Australia was so far in front. Like, we were so ahead of the game when it came to GMO regulation. We've sort of developed really, really good frameworks in Australia over what is now 50 years. I think it'll be 50 years this year.
Today, we're diving into a topic that sits right at the intersection of science, policy, and public perception: genetically modified organisms and gene editing in Australian horticulture. It's an area that's often misunderstood, but one with growing relevance for the future of our food system. And when we decided to explore this topic, I knew exactly who I wanted to speak to: Dr. Jai Denton. I first connected with Jai when I was trying to get my head around the complexities of this space, and he came back to me with one of the most clear, engaging, and comprehensive briefings I've ever received. You could tell from the first sentence how passionate he is about the science and about making it accessible. Jai is the Director of Crop Biotechnology Policy at CropLife Australia, where he works on shaping effective policy and regulation around biotechnology and innovation. He's also worked globally, from gene-drive research labs in Germany and Japan to regulatory work with the World Mosquito Program and the World Health Organization. With a PhD in genetics and a law degree to match, he brings a rare blend of scientific insight and policy expertise. In this episode, we break down what gene editing and GMO actually mean in an Australian context, what's allowed, what's changing, and why it all matters for growers. I start by asking Jai about his origin story in the industry.
I grew up in the Adelaide Hills, and I went to university with the complete intention of becoming a psychologist, and picked up genetics as an elective, and I just ended up really, really enjoying it. I sort of loved the idea of this almost Lego-like view of how things work together, putting different pieces together and getting a whole new and novel outcome, and it just sort of really appealed to me, and it's sort of something I continued on and ended up as a research scientist and for 10 years, and that was a lot of fun, and I got to travel around the world to do that, and then moved back, did regulatory work, and then most recently I've sort of gone more into the policy space where, instead of just accosting people at bus stations talking about how awesome gene technology is, I thought I should probably be paid to do it.
I ask Jai to explain the difference between GMO and gene editing.
So I think one of the easiest ways to I think about this now is the argument of sort of a process versus sort of an outcome or a product. And, if I'm using a particular technology or a particular technique and the product is identical to one that is used, doing an alternative technique, should they be viewed differently? And when we're looking at sort of things like, say, GMO, if I've used gene technology to create an organism that is identical to one that's created using conventional breeding, I would sort of say they're the same thing. And sort of understanding the difference, really, in that case, GMO sort of becomes more of a legal definition. So it's something that is continued to change as our sort of understanding of biology grows and as the introduction of new techniques. So going back, we used to just mutate various plants, create new varieties that way. And a lot of the gene technology is essentially taking the place of what would be viewed as sort of traditional mutagenesis. So the outcome is often the same, but we're now doing this. Then sort of what we've sort of seen since the 70s is the ability to be able to introduce DNA into a new organism. When most people think of GMOs, this is probably what they're thinking of, putting a whole new piece of DNA into an organism from a different organism to achieve some particular outcome. Whereas gene editing is it's included in a package of what we refer to as new breeding techniques, just these sort of things that emerged over the last decade that allow much greater precision in terms of sort of what we do when we do it. So going back to the mutagenesis example, it was incredibly laborious. It's these tiny changes that occur completely at random, and you just have to hope you hit on something useful. Using what I'd view as sort of conventional GN technology, we sort of were able to introduce a new function, but there was still a bit of randomness to it. And as we've moved to the new breeding techniques, we're able to really hone in and achieve a particular outcome.
There has been some exciting regulatory progress in this area.
In June, the Food Standards Australia New Zealand Board approved their proposal, P1055, which has been running for the past 7 years, and it looked at the classification of some of the new breeding techniques, such as gene editing, as whether or not they still belonged in the space of a GMO. And what they've sort of settled on now is this product different to one I could generate with just normal crossing. And what they sort of found was, look, if we've got this organism and it is identical to conventionally bred one, it isn't a GMO. We can't tell the difference. We couldn't even enforce it if there was a rule. And essentially what they've done now with this proposal is sort of say, look, these foods will no longer be classed as GMOs under the FSANZ regulatory system. So that doesn't mean they're unregulated, they're just not regulated as GMOs. They will still be picked up in all of our food regulations. They'll still be picked up potentially as a novel food if that was the threshold they met. They just won't be regulated as GMOs. So what this does now is it sort of streamlines a lot of the exciting work that's happening and provides a pathway to market for some of these new products, some of these new varieties that are being developed. Presently, it's scheduled to sort of go into effect sometime towards the end of August.
Both GMO and gene editing are still used today.
It's probably worthwhile to sort of say, look, all of these techniques have their place and they're all sort of safe and effective ways of developing new varieties. It's just that depending on exactly what we're trying to achieve, one is often better than the other.
Next, we dive into the history of GMO and gene editing and the associated regulatory environment in Australia.
Australia was so far in front. Like, we were so ahead of the game when it came to GMO regulation. We've sort of developed really, really good frameworks in Australia over what is now 50 years. I think it'll be 50 years this year. So going all the way back to 1975, Australia developed what was referred to as the first voluntary guidelines. And this was sort of, just basically guidance on how to work with these technologies.
Some historical applications might surprise you.
And the big one that, really has had probably one of the most significant impacts was the development of insulin from, these microbial cell factories. So, you give it the human gene and it goes away and it can produce giant vats of insulin, as opposed to having to harvest it from pig pancreas. And this was, a complete game changer for, the treatment of diabetes. So it's one of those sort of big, exciting things that emerged from this incredibly quickly. And one of the ones that also comes to mind for me is rennet. So, rather than sort of harvesting from calves, we were able to create this sort of laboratory rennet for cheese making. And that sort of, made a much more reliable, easy to get product that sort of didn't have the same animal welfare concerns that traditionally called rennet does.
The Office of Gene Technology Regulator, or OGTR, and the National Gene Technology Scheme was first set up in 2001 with a regular review framework set up.
And what's happened is there's been sort of 3 major reviews since it was enacted in 2001. And we've seen the most recent of these reviews being commenced in 2017. Unfortunately, though, these processes are typically not expected to take all that long, a couple of years. And unfortunately, we're still yet to see the final implementation of the 2017 review. And it sort of meant that, we've had this amazing framework that has rapidly moved with the times. It's really forward-looking, future-proofing, really carefully balancing the sort of safety of the technology with, ensuring that we can gain the benefits of it. And just because the last review has been a bit delayed in terms of its implementation, we sort of now, our framework is not as progressive as it was, not as future-proofed.
One of the things Jai highlights as being raised in the draft legislation following the third round of reviews is a proposal to introduce risk tiering.
you want any regulation, whether you're talking about GMOs or, your car, your house, whatever, you want it to be proportionate to the risk. And I think one of the things we've sort of seen now is, although there is perhaps a perception of risk here, we've had 30 years of cultivation in Australia, and we've demonstrated time and time again that it is an incredibly safe and effective group of technologies. So I think one of the big things for the risk tiering is, well, okay, let's start looking at more at what are the outcomes of using this technology. If I've got an organism and I cannot tell the difference right down to the genetic level between something that's been created through conventional breeding, I presumably create it much faster. Why is one of these regulated by the OGTR and this other one is not regulated, despite the fact that no one can tell the difference? So the idea is, look, if I'm bringing in a new variety of canola, and we've been growing canola, here for over 20 years, we've done lots and lots of assessments. We know the risks, in each of the sort of OGTR risk categories. We've maintained a sort of really constant assessment of all the data, of all the new research that's come out. So what we'll do is we'll say, okay, look, you don't need to give us, this particular data package, or you don't need to go through this particular framework. We're going to try and speed it up. We're going to say, okay, rather than sort of, X months, it's going to be half X months, or, it's going to be a couple of weeks.
Risk tiering has the potential to be a game changer for faster introduction of potentially beneficial GMO and gene editing technology into the Australian market.
We've sort of had multiple governments now talk about investment, talking about diversifying our economy, and these type of things do require essentially commercial certainty. What a lot of the sort of risk tiering does, it just sort of opens up the market to, okay, well, look, we can bring this product in, there'll be a pathway to market. That pathway, we know roughly how much it'll cost. We know the data requirements that'll be there. And one of the unfortunate things is when you've got a review and the details aren't there, you have companies saying, well, look, do we go now or do we wait? So I think what we've seen is just a lot of people holding their breath, and now they've been doing it for several years, so they're sort of looking a little blue in the face.
I asked Jai why he thinks there has been such a hold-up with the latest review. Is COVID to blame?
I don't think there's any really one answer to this. This is handled by the Department of Health and Aged Care as part of their sort of regulatory function. And they released the first draft of the amended legislation last year. But sort of understanding exactly why that delay has happened is, to be honest, it's quite frustrating. We have all these technologies coming in and, our farmers don't have access to them because, we've got this hold. We're not seeing necessarily people wanting to bring products to market just because we have this. It's probably the worst of both worlds in that if you have to regularly review to make sure you're up to any regulation. But if your review takes so long, it's probably worse than if you'd never done a review at all in many cases, just because it creates so much uncertainty in what's happening, where it's going. And
GMO and gene editing has the potential to introduce a lot of benefits to everyone in Australia. I asked Jai, what are some farmer-focused traits that can come out of GMO and gene editing?
The benefits that you may gain from any given technology are not always doesn't necessarily affect one group. So in this case, just the farmers having a particular benefit, having more options, doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't a downstream consumer benefit as well. And one of the things I really love, and we're sort of seeing more and more, especially on the gene editing, is the sort of speed in which things can move. So, we have incredibly complex farming in Australia. We have so many different, niches, and, they can change from season to season. And Justin here always says, the farmers can't move their dirt. They need the tools to make sure that, every season they can sort of maximize their output. And, whether or not that's different varieties of the same crop, different crops, whatever, we're sort of seeing a lot of this technology now being used to essentially just fast track a lot of the breeding. or allowing us to breed with sort of crops that don't necessarily lend themselves to breeding very well. You've got things like potatoes, that are actually quite hard to sort of breed new varieties into just sort of, long generation times. Looking at, canola and cotton, the big one being, as I mentioned before, was the insect-resistant cotton. And, there's often a lot of criticisms on things like herbicide resistance in this, like, oh, why is that the one you do? And it's worthwhile sort of thinking about these from providing tools to farmers. So a lot of the herbicide resistant varieties allow farmers to forgo tilling on broadacre, which keeps a lot more carbon in the ground.
Jai shares one farmer's story about how this technology affected him.
One of the favorite examples I was given when I sort of first joined here, meeting a cotton farmer, I'm like, oh, what did the insect-resistant cotton varieties mean for you? And he just goes, oh, it means I can spend Christmas with my family. And it's sort of like, I don't have a background in cotton farming, so I'm hugely ignorant. I'm like, well, why? It's like, oh, just because you have to constantly monitor, from one day to the next, you can lose your entire crop, if you're not in there intervening when you see the first sign of, pests coming in. He said that, look, BT changed that for me. The insect-resistant variety changed that for me. The pressure wasn't there to the same degree. It's not that it's completely disappeared. It's just so much less.
The AUSVEG Vegetable Industry Sentiment Survey highlights labour shortages and costs as some of the top 5 reasons 1/3 of farmers are considering exiting the industry. This technology has the potential to address this issue.
I think one of the other things that perhaps many of your growers will understand too is we have labour shortages in Australia for a lot of this, the intense seasonal work that you need to pick a lot of these crops. It's often difficult. And, so we've been looking a lot more in mechanization, how can we speed up this process? How can we remove this sort of huge dependency on labor? And, there is also gene editing that's happening in this space, whether it's sort of modifications that change plant shape to improve, how it's grown so, it can be mechanically harvested, or whether or not, we're just looking at sort of more robust, so resistant to bruising, so, we can process and pack it using machinery rather than sort of hand packing.
Some benefits are also consumer focused.
One of the things I find really interesting is, say, the example of Japan, where you had a country that was historically quite anti-GMO, but has really rapidly embraced gene editing with, a huge amount of enthusiasm to the point where, they've got several products on the market already. Then you had the sort of really rapid uptake of the GABA tomato. So this is a tomato that has increased GABA levels, which are associated with, a series of health outcomes. And it's sort of really, really interesting. It's just sort of changing where it was framed, where you've got an incredibly health conscious population like Japan that's looking and said, we're not concerned so much about the technology. We just want a particular outcome. If this can give us health benefits, we're all in. Sometimes, the benefits are more just sort of novelty than anything else. I know we've sort of spoken about it before, and I really love the AUSVEG campaign on sort of getting kids to eat more veggies. And it's one of those things where I think those type of outcomes are fantastic in this space. A variety of salad greens that have been developed and have just been approved in the US, with it have a lot less of the bitterness flavor. So they basically just use gene editing, removed a gene associated with this flavor, and, you have less of that sort of strong flavor that perhaps kids don't like. I mean, I'm somewhat biased because I think I was probably one of the few children that absolutely loved Brussels sprouts. So that flavor never really bothered me, but I am very mindful that, lots of kids don't like that. So the things that we can do to say, oh, well, look, how do we get kids to eat more? How do we sort of keep things fresher? How do we sort of make a flavor that's, easier, more digestible, whatever?
You might have seen a certain gene-edited fruit going viral on social media.
Which brings me probably to my last example that I often love to use that is a little bit strange. It's a purely aesthetic too, where you've got a variety of pink pineapple that's sort of been on the market now for a few years and arguably a bit sweeter, but it has this sort of lovely pink color when you cut into it. And it was really interesting to sort of see this during the release of the Barbie movie, where suddenly everyone went completely crazy over these and they're selling on eBay for a small fortune. And it's sort of like when people sort of talk about, oh, look, what are the consumer focused traits? It's probably not one I would have necessarily picked, but to sort of suddenly see everyone go, oh my God, this is amazing. I really want this, whether it's to give to my kids associated with the Barbie movie, or, I'm going to make my cocktail look much prettier or whatever else. So I think that's another odd one.
As with any relatively new technology, some consumers have a certain hesitance at the consumption of GMO and gene-edited foods.
There's a lot of really lovely work that's done in Australia by Fazans and OGTR on sort of surveying people, understanding where these concerns come from. And sort of what they've typically shown is there's a bunch of people that are very, very, very anti. There's a bunch of people that are very, very enthusiastic, but the vast majority are neutral. They're sort of, look, okay, I don't really mind. This isn't what is concerning me. If you're not prompted, and people say, well, what are your concerns around, food? Almost everyone at the moment is sort of pulling out price. And that's the big one that sort of sits with people.
Some arguments against are not unfamiliar.
I think it's sort of an odd space in many regards, because we've sort of seen a very long history of very strong, robust regulation. We've seen a huge amount of safety data, both, at the sort of individual variety level and then sort of as an entire industry that sort of has really emphasized the effectiveness of this technology. But it is still kind of frustrating because sort of, like going back to the 1990s, entering uni, and I was seeing these arguments against GMs. I was showing my age there. Seeing these arguments against gene technology that at the time didn't stand up. And then sort of coming into a role like this and sort of seeing the same arguments being put up. And it's like, well, they weren't valid 30 years ago. They're definitely not valid now. We have so much extra data. And so that for me is sort of kind of frustrating. And I think a lot of it is pushed because of sort of misinformation. I've also disliked some of the narrative too, where I think paints farmers as sort of naive or, not involved, as opposed to people who are managing often very large transgenerational businesses that need to make clear, careful decisions based on technology. And 100%, this technology is not necessarily right for every situation or every farmer, and they will make that decision based on sort of what's available and where they want to go and where their market is and, who's buying what product from them. So I think there's a very long way of saying I'm unsure where all the hesitancy is still coming from.
To wrap up, I'm introducing a new question I'll be putting to all our guests. If you had a magic wand, so no budget constraints, no red tape, what's the one thing you'd change in this space?
I'd love to see the third review finalized. That would be, but that is progressing. That will happen. So it's probably a bit of a waste of a magic wand. But I think government policy may not necessarily always be the best tool in this space as well. And there are things they can do around the edge, hopefully, to achieve a particular outcome. And I think one of them would be we need to stop marketing based on fear. Let's follow the science. Let's, understand where we're going. We've, very fortunate in Australia that we've, on the whole, quite accepting of the sort of almost 200 years of climate change science, that we sort of understand, where we've gone, how it's changing. And I'd love to see that sort of happen here as well. And I think probably the other one for me, there is this really strong disconnect with farming in Australia, unfortunately. And as we've become more urbanized, it's something that has continued to grow. And I think in many respects, it's allowed a lot of this fear to creep in because we don't necessarily understand, the work and processes that go into, my bag of potatoes or my apple, my canola oil, whatever it is. So I think we sort of are missing a bit of an opportunity to, essentially take the credibility of the farm all the way to the checkout, and sort of, as a way of like, okay, well, here's an industry that's so critical for Australia, and it's critical for every single person because, we all have to eat. Let's try and sort of understand why choices are made, and, rather than sort of just, oh no, I'm afraid of this, or I'm, not going to do this, understand how this happened and why. So I think that would probably be, if I had a magic wand, it would be sort of to try and remove the disconnect from farming.
You've been listening to the Vegalogue podcast. Don't forget to subscribe and give the podcast a rating and review to help others find us. Vegalogue is produced by AUSVEG, the peak industry body for Australian vegetable, potato and onion growers. You can find more news and information from AUSVEG at ausveg.com.au, on our social media channels, or in the Australian Grower magazine. Thank you for listening.